Well, here we are. Gord's Poetry Show number 60. Here I am in Oakville with Laurence Hutchman, a lifelong poet and professor of English literature, a raconteur of rare abilities, a bilingual raconteur, I might add. I just found that out last week. I've known the guy for months, and I found out he goes and talks to students in French in various schools.
Bien sûr, monsieur.
And here I am, hopeless. I read my Mallarmé, but not because I know the French, but because I love the music of the language. Now, Laurence has a remarkably varied experience in Canadian literature. For example, his book, In the Writer's Words, interviews with legendary modernists such as Ralph Gustafson and P.K. Page and Al Purdy and George Johnson. These names that we all, people of our generation, grew up with and admired alongside the other great modernists of American and British vintage. The Eliots, the Cummings, the Wallace Stevens, the James Joyce, all that great stuff. And I value Laurence because he, amongst other things, he knew some of these people. He actually sat down and talked with them. And this to me is a living link to Canadian modernist literature, because most of these great writers have passed on into eternity. And I believe the younger generation, people in their 20s and 30s, unless they've made a formal study, might not be as familiar with that and would know about, Leonard Cohen and people of that level of iconic status. Margaret Atwood, of course, Michael Ondaatje. But this is a previous generation. And I'd like to get Laurence to talk in any way he feels appropriate about these modernist poets, these famous icons of Canadian modernism, and how they influenced his work and how important he feels about their enduring influence. Yes.
Thank you, Gordon. Yeah, this was a fascinating book to work on. In a writer's words, fascinating because I encountered these writers, as you mentioned, Al Purdy and George Johnson, P.K. Page, Ralph Gustafson. They were very fascinating, I think, because you had a sense when you were talking to them that they had lived so much of the 20th century and beyond. In fact, Gustafson had met people like Bridges and William Carlos Williams. He had a fascinating life, which he was working for the British during the war. In the 1940s, he had studied in Britain. He knew Bridges, and he also lived for a number of years in New York. And he met these writers. He knew that the iconic writers, William Carlos Williams. So he gave unusual perspectives that we don't usually think of these writers as living their real lives, not when they were famous, but as when they were struggling. I remember Gustafson said to me that he met William Carlos Williams, W.C. Williams, in the Gotham Bookmark, and Williams was complaining that he had a hard time getting published. And Gustafson said, if he had a hard time, what chance me?
Yes, yes.
So this is that we see them more in that the real context of the difficulty. It was very difficult for poets to be published in Canada. Even people like F.R. Scott and A.M. Klein. They sold very few books when their poems came out. There wasn't a large market, you know.
Hmm.
But talking to poets like Dudek, um, Louis Dudek, or, uh, was intriguing because he also was in New York, and he was the kind of secretary for Ezra Pound. So he
Ah.
told stories about Pound when Pound was in St. Elizabeth's,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
he wrote. We have the book of letters between Pound and Dudek, and he studied with various scholars in university, and being in New York, it changed. It gave him much more cosmopolitan sense of poetry, and he wanted to bring this poetry back to Canada. This poetry that was infused with people like Williams and the great American poets. And when he came back, he formed this alliance with Irving Layton and Raymond Suster, founded Contact Press,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
there and um, it was like they thrown a stone into the still waters of poetry, and just an explosion. You can imagine, Layton is in those years of 1950s. Again, he was having a hard time with developing a Canadian public. There he was in Kingston, giving away his books of poems, which are now worth thousands of dollars,
Yes.
and he was
Yes.
giving them away,
Uh-huh.
among the pigeons to trying to passerbys, and Dudek too had a hard time, and Dudek told me that he published Leonard Cohen, and
That's right.
he
First book. Yeah.
met Leonard Cohen, and he said, you obviously have talent, you want to publish him, and he asked Leonard to get down on one knee, and he said, I I dub you, sir, you're now a poet. And
Great. Great.
and Dudek was such a force in Canadian poetry, and encouraging a young Canadian writers. I remember I left London in the early 1970s after my degree at University of Western Ontario, and I arrived at in Montreal. My ex-wife said we should go see Louis Dudek. He's a very good poet and seems to be open to young writers. And I took her advice, and I went to see Dudek, and I knocked on the door. And of course, you walk into McGill, and it's very austere, and it's this
Uh-huh.
university going back 150 years,
Yes.
and the kind of large, almost marble-like corridors. And then I knocked on this door, and there was Louis Dudek, this man of letters that I'd read about, and he was sitting in his captain chair, and he swirled around toward me and says, "Come in." And he said, I said, I'm a writer, and I just wanted to come by and say hello. And he says, have you published anything? I said, I have this little chapbook here. And he said, let me see it. So I walked over to him. He was in a suit and looked very, very dapper and distinguished. The books surrounded by his office surrounded by books. And he opened the little chapbook. My daughter said, made of construction paper, orange construction paper. And
What we had to do in the old
Dudek
days.
opened it up, and he looked at it, and he said, "Mm-hmm." And he turned the page. He's concentrated. This is a real reader of poetry. He takes the words, and he just seems to digest them in the form. You can see him. There's an absolute concentration in his eyes, and it's just like Rocky Richard when he's talking about hockey. It's like there's this amazing kind of focus in him, and the next one he says, "Oh, violet rays of the absolute." I like that phrase, he said. And I'm thinking maybe he enjoys this book. Maybe he sees something in it. So then he says, "Ha ha," and he makes these just little sounds. And it's finally he closes the book and he says, "Yeah, I think you're a poet. I'd like to publish you."
Nice.
And that was my introduction to Canadian poetry. And I remember approaching someone in Toronto at the time, and they asked him about my manuscript, and he said, "We don't do business this way."
We don't do business this way. That's good.
And so anyway, with Dudek and with Montreal, there were so many writers at that time coming through Montreal. I found it so stimulating. We had John Newlove was there at a reading,
Yes, John
um,
Newlove,
and
great poet.
and uh, and he read these amazing poems. And then Al Purdy came. I was working at Vanier College at the time, and
Yes,
John Metcalf was there actually on staff.
right.
And so we were surrounded by writers, and I remember Purdy came and he read this poem about the Arctic, you know, and also about homemade beer, hockey players. He had this voice, you know, this amazing voice, like incarnation of the contempt. It was just kind of this balance between um, a very kind of colloquial, down to earth voice with many kind of tones and shifts in in his voice,
Mm,
going from this very serious to the comical in instances. And Dennis really talks about extensively in the book Introduction to
yes.
Collected Poems.
Uh-huh.
And what I thought as Purdy was speaking, it's a mask. He's so much more than this guy who makes homemade beer. And I thought I was intrigued by
Uh-huh.
this sense of the
Uh-huh.
poetry when he wrote, and he read that poem about the last uh, Aboriginal.
Mm,
His name was Kudlik, and he write and I just seemed to watch it as a film. He seemed to telegraph me back to this time of this the ivory thought. The poem ends with the ivory thought. I thought, what a brilliant image! And you can see over here that Purdy's had a conference called the Ivory Thought
uh-huh.
years later about him.
Uh-huh.
And so Purdy was that. So we afterwards we had a chance to meet Purdy, and it was like to me it was like um, I'd seen his work in the Kipling Library, and it was like a revelation to me. Like
Yes.
on the same day, I discovered
Yes.
I think Red Carpet for the Sun by Leighton
Yes.
and Caribou Horses, and I opened the page, and one of the first phrases I saw was uh, "Great Oranges of Dung." Well, in Caribou Horses, I thought, what an unusual image, you know. He can write poetry about anything,
Yes. Yes.
and
Yes.
so and he talks about these horses that are, and all the horses are going back to the beginning of hundreds or thousands of years ago, and
Uh-huh.
ending with them, you know, the horses being tied up in front of the saloon in BC somewhere. And it's a great image, the vast images of time. And we don't realize that these poems have such an impact on us, and they kind of are changing us as we read them.
Yes.
And
Yes.
we don't fully understand their nature, but we sense that there's a great deal in this style, in this voice,
Mm-hmm.
in this persona, and able to capture so many
Mm-hmm.
poems. And we were kind of like discovering Canada in a very different way. Transient, for instance, was an amazing experience. And the summer before, I'd hopped a freight train from Jasper to Edmonton. We spent the night.
Hopped a freight train.
So, and we spent the night
Oh
on top
well.
of an oil car. So I thought, so any poet who could write about that, I thought that was really, and I had that
Right.
the way he kind of described that. But it's not just it's about time and the shifting points of time, and he's moving through different periods of time, and capturing the sense of desperation, of the depression, about looking out in the car, the freight car, and a hobo beside him says, "Got a smoke," and you're just there. He transports you there. Uh,
Yes.
and
Yes.
it's a brilliant poem with so many different wonderful shifts of time, and it's the synesthesia in that poem is amazing. How the eyes digest, you know, a country, you know, and so forth. This amazing poem, and so this experience of discovering Purdy and Leighton in high school,
Yes. I did too.
and
High school when I came to Canada.
the wasteland, and I remember in grade 13, you know. Writing a paper about the wasteland. The year before, I wrote I couldn't I wrote a poem, a paper about Cry the Beloved Country, and it was very basic. But in the year since then, when I discovered reading, and everything changes really when you discover reading. I mean, the in-depth reading, the reading that you focus on the style, and you focus on how things are said, and the techniques, and you focus on the sounds and so forth. It was always there, and I think even grade 8 we had a teacher. We had Mr. Smallbridge, and he asked us to, not asked us, he demanded we memorize 200 lines of poetry.
Yikes. That's a lot.
Punctuation and all.
Whoa, 200 lines. That's more than I can handle.
So anyway, and there was, I remember Lampman and Carmen and DJ Pratt. I love DJ Pratt because they're very short lines, so it was easy to get the lines in, you know. The shark, you know, leisurely swam and so forth. So the power of a poem was very evident these days, you know. And I sometimes wonder, like, I was talking to a teacher, a high school teacher, and I asked her about poetry, and she said, "Oh, poetry's fallen by the wayside the last few years." I'm thinking, you know, what exactly are you teaching?
Yes, you wonder what they're teaching. Maybe more prose.
Obviously more prose. And
Yes.
you go through periods of prose and poetry and so forth. But meeting these writers like Gustafson and P.K. Page and so forth, it was like, I really felt that I was experiencing kind of literary history that.
Oh yeah.
In a sense, when P.K. Page introduced to her husband, who was downstairs, and I went down to meet him, and his name was Irwin.
Was it a diplomat?
Yeah, he was a diplomat.
Yes.
And he was 100 years old at the time.
Yikes.
And he was so elegant and knowledgeable.
Elegant and knowledgeable. That's an achievement. Oh, sorry, you said eloquent. Elegant, but still, at 100, that's an amazing.
Elegance and eloquence, and that was who he was. You know? Yes.
That's a wonderful image. Thank you for that.
And I remember, because I knew that he was very instrumental in journalism and plays and so forth. And P.K. Page, again, this wonderful career being the diplomat, being the wife of a diplomat, and she was she lived in Australia. She was in Brazil for a number of years, and then returning to BC. And again, and she was involved too with, you know, First Statement and Northern Review. And she talked extensively about meeting Klein, about how he looked, and the power of his voice and so forth. So and again, capturing that poetry was, it was controversial. It was an exciting, and people were writing these great poems, like, you know, the portrait of a writer's landscape. And F.R. Scott's The Laurentian Shield, you know, very powerful poems, the general part of the canon, you know. But I liked and appreciated how much they were able to talk about their aesthetics and how finely attuned they were. So talking.
Yes, that certainly comes out in the book for sure.
Yeah, so it was a very exciting. I mean, and Dudek talks about the creation of his own ideas, his poetic ideas, and in Atlantis and on Europe and so forth, Europe and on Mexico. And so Dudek had a structural and stylistic elements that he wanted to develop in these poems. And the long poems, for instance, about the sea. And Dudek talks about that extensively, sea being like time. And I think, too, Dudek did a series of poems, and one of I discovered in one of his books that these one of the poems was about me. I discovered after he died. As
yeah.
And
it must have been quite thrilling for you.
Yeah, it was unusual to discover his voice, and because it kind of reflected me at the time, and I thought that was interesting. And suddenly, I'm part of this longer poem.
Yes. Oh, you think you can find it? Good for you.
Um,
We're sitting in a room with thousands of books, mostly poetry. But Lawrence is almost famous for being able to find things in, oh, I don't know, less than 10 minutes. And while he's off looking, I'll show you the Purdy anthology that he contributed to. I don't know if the light's messing it up. It's called Beyond Forgetting, celebrating 100 years of Al Purdy, edited by Howard White and Emma Scoggin. And many poets have contributed to this. I won't even try to illustrate it. There's far too many, but it's a fine anthology. And you have found what you were looking for.
yeah, the book is called Continuation 2. So Dudek had a particular idea about this book, and he wanted to get the sense of the spontaneity of poetry. He wanted to get the sense of the leaps that poetry is capable of, the vast spaces it can cover in a short period of time. And he wanted to have this kind of free-flowing and free-flowing idea of images and ideas, which would seem to be on the surface very almost random, but underneath you could see there's a larger governing intelligence that's moving these things. And this will make the power of the poem become, because of the spontaneity and this kind of formal, that elegance of the work, and powerful because it had that tension between the formal and the feeling of something. And Dudek really emphasized this tension of poetry, that because we have this form, and we have flow, we have rhythm, and so forth, and it creates tension between form and flow. And here's the poem. And so Dudek had writers come into his office, and I think David Solway was there. David Solway, Ken Norris, Ray Philippe, and a number of other poets. Mark Pleward was there. Moore and Hutchman come in. It's 11 a.m. We sit and talk about poetry, the media. Whether words can do anything against the evil. I tell them that rage is futile, one must develop some good. Feeling is all. And think of ecstasies, the small perfect things of Nietzsche. Moore is sad and find no ecstasies. We tell him to live now, live for the moment. He expounds Scientology as secular religion. Hutchman is philosophical, confident, looks at some great white light blazing before him. We compare poets, encourage the muse. It's 12 o'clock. They rise to leave. I say something about next week. The poetry fades away.
I say something about next week. I like that line.
So those were the encounters with the writers that I had.
Fascinating. Did you? I briefly mentioned the Al Purdy anthology here.
No.
Would you care to talk about last night's experience, or the
I can
poets
read
in
the poem.
the book? Yeah. This was at the Free Times Cafe in Toronto last night. And was it as crowded as I thought it would be?
Yeah, it was a full house.
Yeah. It's a very small place,
it was
but
like
very cozy.
James Arthur, John Otten, Bruce Meyer,
Yes.
myself, and a few others were reading. And
and I can't see Al Purdy ever fading from his maybe almost iconic status in Canadian literature, Canadian poetry.
Sure.
You know, he's just such a character, over and above his fine contribution.
You know, he's a very provocative character. He's the most difficult person I had to interview. But it was fascinating.
Cranky, obstreperous,
he was very obstreperous.
Whatever. Yeah.
I asked him about influence. He says, and I said, poetry about making of yourself. Making yourself? What do you mean? And then he actually he
you got some quotes from the book? Yeah, of course you do. No?
No, I don't have it here.
Oh, all right. But yeah, well, we get that impression from others that talk about him for sure. Um, David McFadden's got quite a section in one of his Trip Around the Lakes books where
Yeah,
he's
that's a beautiful book. Yeah.
hanging with Al at the A-frame. Really funny. If I'd brought it along, I'd read from it, but I didn't.
So I asked Al about this question of influence,
Uh-huh.
and he said, because mostly it seems important to other people. Other people are always talking about influence. Well, as a matter of fact, I think it's interesting too. Don't you ever wonder how you happen to be writing the way you are? Who influenced you? Whether you submerge those influences or not?
Yeah. Yeah. How we submerge influences, it's an alchemical process, I think. At first you're aware of it, and then it slips away because you get influenced by other things, and then 30 years goes by and you look at a line and you think, whoa, that's awfully close to Dylan Thomas. I better be careful. Or, a bit Yeatsian, that sort of thing.
Will arise and going out. Yes.
Yeah, I find it in my own stuff. And even ancient, Chinese and Japanese stuff that you've read years ago, with its concision and its lack of exfoliation. You write a simple line and you go, ooh, that's kind of lipo there.
So here's the poem, Al Purdy's Place. I turn on to the road leading to Emiliusburg. Nearly 20 years since I visited this place where you wandered under the large beams through the old grist mill and searched for dusty motes of sunlight until you stared into the face of Owen Roblin. The 73 Ford is gone. Your tall, lanky figure does not stride to meet me again. The waters of Roblin Lake are rough. Around broken boards I step to see blue wooden chairs weathered on the deck. Urith, Michael Ondaatje, and Margaret Laurence would have drunk beer here late into the summer night. The old cabin you built as a study is locked. In the box by the door I see a lamp that would have shone on your hiccuping typewriter, on the poems that you spoke of Fidel on Revolutionary Square, of Gus and you before the Kremlin, searching for the ghost of Helen in the dusty city of Troy, recounting the tough, angry Tarahumara woman in Mexico, the scenes evoking the ghost of Machu Picchu and your friend Earl. You sat in that study until it became the freight car, crossed the prairies into the sudden mountains, until the dust of the mountain, of the land, enter you in both voices, speaking now through your poems. You were working on reaching for the Beaufort Sea, talking about time, how we continue more in the past, how we live on a thin edge, a slice of time that exists only in the present before it becomes the past. I remember the letter from Emiliusburg inviting me to send you poems. I still hear your distinct voice with its currents of wit and humor, gusto, a build-up and release. I remember that time in Montreal at El Gitano after so much sangria, when we argued poetry late into the night. Through the rough gravel of Purdy Lane, I drive to the cemetery along the river. There, in the wet grass, is the voice, the black shiny tomb with the words, the voice of the land. Someone has left a note and stuck a ballpoint pen in the earth.
Thank you for that. That was great. Nice rhythm there.
Mm-hmm.
Very nice. Very evocative too. Ballpoint pen stuck in the earth. Great. Love it.
Well, that's also kind of Purdian image that you know.
Yes.
About the farmers and sticking their thumbs in the earth in the country north of Belleville.
Ah, right. Yeah, he honored the practice of agriculture many times, as maybe we should all do. Certainly, I, as a city boy coming to Canada in 68, 69, I plugged into a suburban area where farm kids were being bussed in from the farms north of the suburban area.
Yeah.
And I got to hear about, clearing rocks from fields and farmers building themselves brick houses
Yeah.
from the profits of the First World War,
Mm-hmm.
supplying the forces where they'd only had, you know, frame homes before. Well, that sort of experience was very, very interesting to hear about that. And to realize that the area in which I was going to school was only founded, civilized, you know,
Yeah.
in 1840, 1850. It
Yeah.
was only 100 years before, 110, 120.
So one of the things that I found really fascinating about Purdy, and I did find many things fascinating about him because I wrote my PhD dissertation on him.
Ah,
And but one of the things as a writer I found really intriguing was his sense of discovering of his history in his backyard and where he lived,
mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm.
in his poems in Caribou Horses and in later in Owen Roblin and in my other books, he explores the history of this particular place, finding
Mm-hmm.
Owen Roblin.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's what I discovered when I was working on my dissertation in the Chateauguay Valley. I stayed out there in the Chateauguay Valley and living in an 18th century stone house.
Mm.
I suddenly found that I was having a lot of um, poems coming to me about the place where I grew up because where we were living was very similar to where I lived with its ravines and its big river in the backyard and so forth. And so I had a dream, and in the dream, the farmers was a farmer from Emory said, "Come back to visit us. We have a story to tell you,
Ah,
or stories to tell you." And so this out of this dream came the birth of the book of Emory, so I started writing these poems during the same time as writing my dissertation,
mm.
and I found it very stimulating working on that dissertation on the works of Purdy, Newlove, and Avison, and it seemed to help me to access that hidden history.
Mm.
And then I went to Toronto and through a woman called Sheila Lambrinos, who was the sister of Colleen Thibodeau,
Ah,
the
yes,
poet,
right.
wife of James Rainey. She said she's written a kind of a little book on Emory. I thought, how's that possible? It wasn't there wasn't apparently uh, a lot of Emory still left at that time.
Mm.
But the more when I opened up, there's a map there, and it was like this legend, and I suddenly realized I knew these people. I knew that the sons and daughters of these farmers, and I knew,
Mm-hmm.
in fact, in some cases, I knew the farmers. So I thought there is a history here. So I went back and I spent 3 years researching this area about Emory, and that was really really fascinating to discover that how many the farmers going back to really to the beginning of uh, Ontario,
Mm-hmm.
when Lieutenant Governor Simcoe came here, and
Mm-hmm.
these families were connected to him, and they'd some of they were escaping from the American Revolution, and they arrived here, and then they were fighting in the rebellion of 1837,
Ah,
and
yes,
later they were
right.
involved in the First World War, the Second World War, and it was in this period that I discovered. Actually, it was I discovered because it was a bell and a plaque from the First World War that was put into the high school, and I tracked down Ori Truman, and he was the one responsible for having the, the that bell and the plaque put into the new school so they wouldn't forget. And it was kind of ironic, really, because at every Remembrance Day we'd say, "Lest we forget," and we'd put the janitor, who was a war veteran himself, would go and he'd place this wreath on before the plaque. It had three names on it, and one of the names was a soldier who actually lived in that very place in the log cabin, which was where the high school was.
Ah,
So that so he died in Belgium, but he lived where the high school was. So, and it was discovering things like this and the history of the people who lived in in that place. And Ori Truman had gone through the Battle of Britain. He was a medical officer, and he was in the Battle of El Alamein. The
Mm-hmm.
hellish battle went on for 7
Mm-hmm.
days. It's
Mm-hmm.
Rommel, and then he went through Sicily up to way up to the peninsula. So he talked about his experiences in this, and so I discovered a real history of this place through this little village.
Mm-hmm.
Because I remember going taking the chestnuts from where the old school was, the old two-room schoolhouse, and the old church, and it was fascinating. People like Elizabeth Arden went to that school, that
Really?
competition. Yeah, went to that one-room schoolhouse.
Huh. Is that what you wrote about in Two Maps of Emery?
Yeah, that's all of those experiences.
Uh-huh.
I almost got arrested because I was exploring the area of Elizabeth Arden's log cabin. I was trying to find it, and I came out, and the police said, "Put your hands up." They thought I was a suspicious character.
Oh, and how old were you at this point?
Well, I was a university professor at that point.
Oh, I see. A very distinguished human being, and there you were on the point of being arrested. Was it like a private property thing?
Yeah, I had to climb it down a 10-foot fence to get into it.
Snagged your tweed jacket on the 10-foot fence. Yeah.
So I was hoping that they would realize who Elizabeth Arden was, but the woman police officer didn't know her, so they
too
had to
bad.
check me out.
Too bad. Did you write about that in this book?
I didn't write it. I did write about the trip there. Yes.
Yeah, it's a great little book. It evokes the time well. And of course, having lived in the GTA for like 45 years, and I didn't know there was a suburb or town called Emery. It's close to where Weston is now.
Yeah.
Yeah, not a
It was
clue.
part of Weston, yeah.
Not a clue. And I remember the old Weston from 1971 or whatever. But I certainly didn't know that.
Yeah. So this is exciting. Is discovering your history through these people.
Yes.
It's really, and they're fascinating, and they're all storytellers, and they had these great stories to tell. And I was discovering that particular history.
Yes.
That I had.
Uh-huh.
That we have, and I think it's all there. We just have to scratch the surface. And I found myself actually digging in the earth, uncovering old houses. So. The Roundtree house that I found in Roundtree Mills Park, and it was these kind of unearthing these things that I found so fascinating. But that's what Purdy was doing through Owen Roblin. He was going back and the old mill. The old mill is now part of the Pioneer Village now, so it's being torn down stone by stone and recreated actually.
I remember in the 70s when Alice Munro was publishing her first 4 or 5, 6 books. I felt that I was getting like this psychic geography of southwestern Ontario in the early books. And it really gave me an intimacy. And of course, she's gone on to more international subject matter and fame. But in those first, 3, 4, 5 books, I
Lives
really
of
felt
Girls and Women, for
all
sure.
that stuff.
Yeah.
All those little...
That is our history.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Fascinating stuff, too.
Yeah.
Great. I think she's obviously as a Nobel winner, she's greatly appreciated. But I wonder how many people read the early books, as I do with Margaret Atwood. People, she's hugely well known these days and well read. But how many people read her first book of stories, Dancing Girls, or Bluebeard's Egg, or Lady Oracle?
Yeah.
And maybe that's as it may be with, you publish 20, 30 books.
Yeah.
Some of them get more prominence than others.
Yeah.
Got something there you'd like to read, Laurence?
Yeah, this is one of poems from Personal Encounters. This is
one of my favorites of your books, I might add.
Thank you. So this is my poems about meeting Irving Layton, Leonard Cohen, John Newlove, Al Purdy.
Excellent.
And Raymond Suster.
Well, we still got some time, so go fly on.
So sometimes the dreams are the stuff that life is made of. And and in a case of memory, the book was born out of a dream, and this one is called Poetry Reading Dream. Have you ever been in a dream and tried to read the poem you wrote, or at least imagined you wrote, but couldn't because it wasn't there? I'm going through the pages as the book is nearly blank. There's not one single fully recognizable poem. This is a nightmare. I continue going through the books, and now I'm starting to lose it. Every time I find a book, there's something wrong with it. And the audience is getting larger, people hanging all over the place. I scavenge through the archival pile looking for poetry in all this mess. Suddenly, the small, dingy, fake Parisian studio space becomes a large Montreal bibliothèque. Half the walls disappear. I'm in a country world with parks and rivers and mountains. And I'm feeling as high as a mountain and begin with a poem. I was walking in the city and there was music everywhere. And everything was light, light. There was a rhythm in every motion, every thought, every glance. And I was enjoying it, growing with it, my body swinging and moving. You have to look for the mountains in the city. You didn't know they had mountains in Montreal. Look at them, ladies and gentlemen. Look beyond your library eyes to the glowing peaks. Feel the mountains in your blood, in your hands, in your feet. Let them sing in your veins. Let them tell you how to speak. Let them swing, shake, and break you. Let the mountains speak with you from every corner of your life, from every lighted space of your being. Let them sing out of every neglected moment, out of every impossible dream. Let the mountains sing with you. Let them awaken to their eyes. And the audience is swaying. They're with me. I can see the city mountains in their eyes. I can feel the excitement in their veins. I can sense the hunger for the ordinary. I can touch their elemental game. Why can't every reading be like this?
Very good. I enjoyed that. Excellent. Thank you. I'm never quite sure how much memory this computer has, but I haven't gone beyond 45 minutes on a film. So if we do go beyond it, it can suddenly just cut off. So I will play it safe and perhaps hint that sometime in the future we'll do part two of this because your work and your memories and your thoughts on those memories and the significance of them to me is absolutely fascinating. And I could easily natter on to you and listen with you for another hour. But the technical issues will prevent that.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope you've enjoyed this 42 minutes as much as I have.
It was a delight, Gordon. Always a delight to talk to you.
Thank you. Thank you. And Gord's Poetry Show thanks you too.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
And for the rest of you poetry fans out there, thank you for joining. And there'll be more of these, more interviews, more Laurence, more poetry. Anytime now. We're coming up to Christmas, so I may get a little squished in a corner, as we all do. But thank you for watching. And may poetry infect every inch of your life. Seriously. Thank you.